We had a suspect, but law enforcement at the time would not follow him. And he was at a car dealership buying a vehicle, and he just so happened to be sitting down with his ID on the table and all the things that the detective said he would need to identify this person. I called the detective from that CarMax dealership and said, I'm standing right here. I could kill this man. And that detective lost it. He said, Get out of there now. Get out of there before I charge you for interfering with an investigation. I said, What investigation? You told me to
Right.
get you killed. You told me you had no idea who this man was. So that forced
Mhm.
this detective to do his job.
Mhm. You're listening to When God Intervenes, the podcast where faith, hope, and healing come together for families with a loved one battling addiction. Hi, and welcome to another episode of When God Intervenes. I'm your host, Daryl Rogers. I'm here today with Perla Mendoza. And Perla, I consider a close friend. We have worked together on some advocacy work in Washington, D.C. We've met a couple of different times in the past 2 years. I've gotten to know her a little bit. I describe her as a ball of energy, and Perla is every bit of that, and then some. Perla has started a nonprofit that's called Project Eli, named after her son. And with Project Eli, she does prevention speaking. She also distributes naloxone. Is that right, Perla?
That's right.
And trains people on how to use it. Today, we're going to get into her story a little bit, and we'll talk about some of the things that come up around her story as we go. We have a very similar story. There's a lot of commonalities, as there are quite often are with these types of stories. So stay tuned. It's going to be a really, really good story. And I know there are going to be a lot of lessons that you, the listener, are going to learn from this story. So thank you for being here with me today, Perla, and for agreeing to be a guest on When God Intervenes.
Oh, thank you for having me, Daryl. Such an honor to be on with you today. Thank you.
Did I miss anything in your introduction? Is there anything else you'd like to tell the listeners before we get into your story?
You did great. You did great. This is a labor of love for me. So I'm just honored to be able to be on with you and share a little bit about my experience in hopes that it'll help other parents and encourage your listeners today.
I like to think of myself as a fighter. Sometimes of the fighting is hard. Sometimes I get beat up a lot, but I keep fighting. I keep getting back up and coming back for more. So I know you're a lot the same way. You seem like we are kindred spirits like that. Like you're very passionate about the work that you do. I can say that the work that I do has been healing for me. There's been a lot of spiritual growth that's occurred, and I've met people through the line of work that I do that it wouldn't have happened had I not lost my son Chase. Unfortunately, it took something like that for me to it really woke me up and brought me into a new, deeper relationship with God. And there's been a lot of spiritual growth. I'm still on a journey and have a ways to go yet. But tell us about your son Elijah, and I know you call him Eli for short. And why don't you tell us about Elijah and just go back to the beginning of his childhood and what kind of a kid he was and what he was like growing up?
Absolutely. I do want to say, Daryl, that I commend you, for doing what you do. I know firsthand it's not easy to get up and share and try to support others despite our own grief and loss. And there's very few fathers that I come in contact with that are doing what you do. So hats off to you. I have so much respect for the work that you have done, and it truly is an honor to be here. Elijah was my only child. He was everything to me. He was such a wonderful little boy growing up, very thoughtful, generous, considerate. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, this boy would do some of the sweetest things. I have some of the most beautiful memories of Elijah. he was a sweet little boy that wanted to make mama proud. And he was an obedient son that, you know, would, I mean, he did make me proud. Even until this day, I'm still proud of my boy, despite what has happened. Elijah was a great kid that endured things that no little boy should have to have gone through. I was a single parent for most of Elijah's life. His father and I separated when Elijah was 4, and his father was in, the picture, but he was living a double life, if you will. I'm not here to talk about that man, but you know, he sexually abused Elijah between the ages of 6 and 9. And I didn't learn about this until my son was 19 years old, struggling with addiction and in a rehab.
Mm. Mm. So many of the families that I work with, it becomes apparent that their child is struggling with addiction. Usually their coping mechanism is their substance use, whether it's drugs or alcohol. And I mean, there's all kinds of other addictions. Those are the ones that we tend to work with the most. But yeah, certainly addiction is a coping mechanism for dealing with trauma in most cases, or some sort of underlying issue that's going on, some type of psychological problem. Sometimes it's very apparent. Other times, parents don't really know what that is. And I still, to this day, I don't really know 100% what my son's issue was around all of that. There could be something that I don't know about, but I think there's, his he did have an ADD, ADHD diagnosis early on, and so he struggled in the classroom. I think he really thought of himself not as intelligent. He didn't think he was smart, and I think that was a self-esteem thing, and that was could have been part of the issue with him. But yeah, certainly trauma is quite often part of the issue, and what's traumatic for one person maybe is not for another, and some things are more traumatic than others, and certainly what Elijah went through that's a very traumatic experience.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, I've met hundreds of parents since the loss of my child, and I'll say that all of our kids, had different types of experiences. So I don't want to label any child as, they use drugs because they were sexually abused. No, that's
hmm,
not the case for all.
that's right.
Not everyone who uses substances comes from a dysfunctional family or has mental health issues. I think those are labels that society often tries to place on families and children. And as uncomfortable and hard as it is to share my son's story at times, I think it's necessary.
Hmm.
It's not an excuse for drug use, but it took me years to understand, what my baby was going through. And
Hmm.
seeing your child struggle is devastating to parents.
Hmm.
I would have done anything to have my son here. And I've often heard, children need love. And I got to tell you, if love could have saved my boy, he would be here. And I'm sure that you can attest to that,
Hmm.
Daryl.
Hmm. For sure. Yeah.
So this is part of me sharing this story is to break some of that stigma. And, Elijah, throughout his life, he was a good student. He never had problems at school. He maintained a B, type of grades throughout elementary, junior high, and up until about the 10th or 11th grade. That's when I started to notice changes in him. I mean, this boy was an athlete. He had friends in all friend groups. I remember when Elijah passed away, I had a young lady reach out to me who was from China, and she was a foreign exchange student who met my son in junior high. And she tells me that Elijah was one of her first friends in school, and he was considered a popular kid, if you will. So she was just thrilled when he came up to her. She says that she was sitting alone, scared, and that this boy came up to her, introduced him, and then brought her to his friend group. And she was just so grateful for his kindness. And that's the type of boy Elijah was, just like many of our kids. Our kids, they were good kids that
Mm,
made
mm,
bad decisions sometimes.
mm,
I'm not here to cover up for Elijah. Elijah, I talked to him about drugs and alcohol throughout his life. I worked in that field for many years. And, I those drugs that I was able to talk to my son about, those weren't drugs that he was into. And ultimately, what killed Elijah was fentanyl.
mm, mm,
Elijah thought he was consuming something that he had taken before, something that had once been prescribed to him. And it turned out to be nothing but counterfeit pills made of a binding agent, a filler, and fentanyl.
mm,
One pill killed my son. And as someone who worked in the healthcare and drug and alcohol prevention field, if you will, I was shocked to hear. First off, I had never heard of fentanyl at the time of my son's death. Elijah died in 2020. And so I thought, why is no one talking about this? Did my son know about fentanyl? I have all these questions. But
mm,
the one thing that I know for a fact is that I didn't know, and I'm his mom. I never had the opportunity to warn my boy about the deceptive practices that involve fentanyl, like making counterfeit pills that look like something that would typically not kill you if you just took one pill.
mm.
But because of fentanyl, he's no longer here.
Certainly the landscape since Chase died in 2014, and the landscape changed drastically from the time that I started doing prevention speaking. It really did, it was probably not too much before you heard about fentanyl. It was probably 2018, 2019. I first started, maybe a little bit earlier, because I got in touch with some of Chase's friends, friends who were using drugs, and they were educating me. At least one of them was, on some of the things that were going on, and I wanted to find out. I wanted to understand what was happening, and that's how I was beginning to get a little bit of an education. Yeah, fentanyl really changed the landscape so much, because kids could, before, they could experiment with a lot of different things and didn't have to worry about a fatal overdose so much. But now the fentanyl can even be like, it's quite often in drugs that you wouldn't expect it to be in, and sometimes it's because of cross contamination. The drug dealer is handling different types of drugs, and it only takes just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of fentanyl to cause someone to have a fatal overdose, especially someone with no tolerance for it, that's built up. And so you get a little bit of fentanyl accidentally over in some marijuana they're selling or something else, and then that can happen easily. But certainly in Elijah's case, it was a different scenario. He was actually sold a pill that was designed that way, to have fentanyl in it, to sold to him as Xanax, but have fentanyl in it.
You know, it's so unfortunate. After losing Elijah, I like took a deep dive. I remember as the coroner wheeled out my boy's dead body. I mean, it was the worst moment of my life. But I remember shortly after having a detective come up to me and say, "Ma'am, I suspect that the cause of death was fentanyl." And I thought, what is that? I've never heard of it. That wasn't a drug that my son was into. We
mm,
never had a conversation about that. My son, why fentanyl? How? And I had so many questions. So I started doing research. And, you know, I was just at a loss. I thought, why aren't we talking about this? And really, that was the motivation behind starting my nonprofit.
mm,
My only purpose for starting that nonprofit was to help warn other parents and young people like Elijah that
mm,
there is this, drug that was being contaminated. I mean, that was contaminating other street drugs.
mm,
And sometimes people do that on purpose. I actually tracked down the person that sold this to my son. He sold it to my son via social media on a Snapchat platform.
mm,
I read the conversation that they had. For whatever reason, my son had saved some of those messages. My son appeared to trust this young man. So when I found him, I thought, there's no way this 19-year-old young man knows what he's selling. I had mercy on him and I reached out to him. I said, look, young man, you obviously have no idea what you're selling. Please stop. My son trusted you, and what you sold to him was nothing but counterfeit pills.
mm,
Elijah purchased 15 pills that night, the night that he died. We found 14 the next day, and they were taken to a laboratory, and I was told that each one of those pills contained a lethal dose of fentanyl.
mm,
So when I found the dealer, I tried to warn him, and I thought, he obviously doesn't know. That was my mindset. I thought, who could do
mm,
this?
mm,
But he did know, and he had no remorse. He continued to sell his poison pills for 2 years until he was finally stopped by the DEA. Thankfully, he is now in federal prison and he'll be there for many years. I have to say, though, Daryl, I don't get joy from knowing that there's another young man sitting in prison,
right.
but he would not have stopped otherwise. It
Mm,
took
mm,
him being forced to stop by law enforcement. He knew what he had done and he
yeah.
continued anyway.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I hope he finds salvation in prison and turns his life around. And you know, but yeah, it's sad that he. I don't know what led him to make those kind of choices, but man, really, really sad.
I gotta
Mm,
say, it seemed like it was motivated by greed and
mm,
money.
well,
Money is the root of all evil. And
mm,
I remember him testifying when we went to court and saying that he did it as a method to support his family, and
mm,
that, he asked for mercy from the judge because he didn't have the finances. And, he had all these excuses for why he was doing what he did. But I remember the federal attorney, the U.S. attorney, telling me that at the time of his arrest, he was dressed with designer gear worth about $70,000. He
mm,
had a Rolex on, he had
mm,
designer from head to toe. And so, I mean, this wasn't a young man that was trying to survive. This was a young man that was profiting from other people's suffering. Because the fentanyl doesn't kill you, Daryl.
mm,
It's likely to get you addicted. And that type of addiction is not one that you want to be involved with. I mean, come
right.
on.
Yeah,
50 times stronger than heroin?
yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah, not one that a lot of people survive or come back from to have a productive life. Yeah, it is a tough one.
I do want to give the listener some hope, though, just in case
Mm,
there's anyone that is struggling with a family member, or maybe they're struggling themselves with an addiction to fentanyl. There is hope, and I've met several people that have recovered from
mm,
a fentanyl addiction. So please do not lose heart. There is hope and there's resources out there. I
yeah,
think for me, the conniving part of this all is that they're selling it disguised as something else, something that
Mm-hmm.
typically would not kill the user. And so that's the warning.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing on the streets these days is safe, right? Unless you're getting it from your doctor.
Mm-hmm.
No pills that are found on social media or even from a friend. You got to assume that they're tainted.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's take us back to Elijah's story for a minute. And just a note here that it was about in the middle of the 10th grade when I was began really having trouble with Chase. And I think that's a really tough age.
Well, that's about the same age Elijah started to
Mm-hmm.
struggle. At
Mm-hmm.
first, I thought, okay, you know, I was a single mom for many years. I'm a woman. We have different types of ways of expressing ourselves, usually. And when I started to notice these changes in my boy, I initially started, his grades started to drop. He no longer took pride in his academics as he wanted. He was like the smart kid, and especially in my family, that boy was smart. He
Mm-hmm.
was, I mean, he taught me algebra when I was in college. I was a young mom, so I remember taking my first college algebra class and I was stuck. And my son came over and said, "Let me see if I can help you." And I thought, I immediately kind of dismissed him because he was so much younger than I was. And I said, "No, son, it's okay. This is college work." And to my surprise, my son had already taken that course in high school. So he was able to teach me. And he was a great teacher, by the way. But yeah, so I noticed that his grades were going down,
Mm-hmm.
his appearance. He always took pride in like his haircuts, and he wasn't one of those kids that rolled out of bed and went to school in their pajamas, if you know what I mean. I'm not knocking anyone that does that.
Mm-hmm.
I may have done that once or twice when I was a teen, but I'm just saying that I noticed these subtle changes, and I thought, okay, maybe he's going through puberty. And maybe he's going through like hormonal changes, and that's why he's being a little grouch because his attitude was changing as well. But it continued, and it kind of, it was getting worse. Now he no longer had interest in hanging out with some of the friends that he once hung out with, or playing basketball, or going to the gym. Those were things that he did almost on a daily basis. Those were his outlets. And so I was concerned, and I would hound him, if you will. Every day it was like, okay, Elijah, well, what's going on? I noticed an attitude, and it would bother him. So I said, okay, if you're not going to talk to me, son, I want you to talk to someone, because as your mom, I can see that something's off, Elijah. Like, you don't. And he'd get so offended. Mom, leave me alone. There's nothing wrong. I'm fine. But as a parent, I knew that there was something off. So I told him, look, Elijah, I work very hard to provide for you and to make sure that you have medical insurance and these resources. Let's use them. And so he agreed to go to therapy with one condition. He didn't want me to tell anyone about it, which
Mm-hmm.
I really regret. He was just so concerned about the social stigma that is often associated with, mental health, and taking medication. So I made him a promise that I wouldn't tell anyone as long as he participated in, and he
Mm-hmm.
did. He went to therapy for several months, and was prescribed medication for his anxiety and depression. I got to tell you, Daryl, I was like, what is this kid depressed about? I didn't
Mm-hmm.
know. I didn't know, what I was about to find out. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I thought, we have, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to say that I tried really hard to give him all the things that I thought he would need to be happy and,
Mm-hmm.
and,
Mm-hmm.
and prosper. But nevertheless, he was struggling, and they gave him this medication to help with depression and anxiety. And Elijah hated the idea of taking these meds. So almost after every therapy session, he'd end it with, okay, so can I stop taking these meds now? Like, I'm doing better. My room is clean. I went to school on time all week. And the doctor, eventually said, okay, you are doing much better, Daniel. Let's give it a shot. Daniel
Mm-hmm.
was his first name, by the
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm.
And, we're going to give it a shot. I'll see you in a month. Well, by the time that month came around, my son was not doing well. He started to struggle again, and now he was nearing the age of 18, and it was a lot harder for me to force him, if you will, to go to therapy. You
Mm-hmm.
know, he could easily go in and say, I don't want to do this. And they'd say, okay, well, session's over, whereas before I felt like I had a little bit more say,
Mm-hmm.
and that was a challenge. And so shortly after, um, he stopped taking his meds, he started to struggle again with some of those same symptoms, but now they seemed even worse than they were before.
Mm-hmm.
It was harder for me to get him to slow down and get the help that he needed.
Sometimes that's the downside to medication. Same with drugs. The drugs, the street drugs that they take are their solution to whatever trauma or anxiety they're feeling, whatever the cause of that is, whatever's going on in their head. The drugs, most people think are the problem, but they're really their solution. Now, they're not a good solution. Obviously, it's not a good coping mechanism. But there's a lot of similarities between the street drugs and the prescribed drugs, the medicine, in that you can become dependent on them, right? So now he had the prescribed drugs, which were giving him some relief temporarily, but then he came off of them, and now his anxiety is worse than it was before, right? Instead of better. So
It
yeah.
happens
Anyway.
way too often. But
Mhm.
that's what I started to notice. And shortly after that, I remember he was self-medicating on marijuana. And I gotta say, I hate to admit this, but I didn't think like marijuana was the worst thing in the world for
Mhm.
someone to
Mhm.
do. But because I was his mom, and he was still a child in my eyes. He was 17, and I thought, Elijah, I cannot allow this in my home.
Mhm.
I don't want you to do this. If you want to do this, wait until you're an adult. But obviously, when you do this, it's affecting you because, he wasn't keeping up with his schoolwork and doing those things that he should have been focused on as a young man.
Mhm.
So I don't know if, a combination, it was that. And then I remember, because this was now a reoccurring issue, like he would come home or I could smell him, and we were constantly, in a battle, if you will,
Mhm.
over it.
Mhm. And
And
you
I
still
remember,
didn't, yeah, at this point, you still didn't realize what the real issue was. You didn't realize the underlying trauma, right?
absolutely not. And so I remember going into his room one day while he was away, and I searched it, and I found a baggie with a
Mm.
bunch of white pills that looked exactly like Xanax. And I thought, what the hell?
Mm.
I thought, because remember, he hated the idea of taking medications, right?
Mhm.
When he was
Mhm.
being prescribed them, he hated the idea of taking them. So I thought, did this boy just save all these medications? Because there is a handful of these pills in his drawer. And I thought, oh my God, instead of taking them, he spit them out. That's what I thought.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
What I didn't realize is that now he was self medicating. And so when I confronted him, I said, what is this? And he said, Mom, what's the big deal? It's the same stuff that the doctor was giving me. It
Mhm.
just helps me go to sleep. Like, what's the big deal? You wanted me to take it before. And I said, yeah, but you're supposed to take it from a doctor, son.
Mhm.
Where did you get this from? And I remember him sharing with me that, he we didn't live in an affluent neighborhood, but the surrounding community, you know, was very, I mean, it's a beautiful community. And the friends that he had that lived there had parents who were doctors and surgeons. And so they had access to some of this stuff. And so
Mm.
I remember him saying that he got it from his friends. And I thought, okay, I took them, I confiscated them, flushed them down the toilet, which I probably shouldn't have done. But I mean, I didn't know what else to do at the time, right? I should have thrown them away in a some other type of disposal.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, my point was I got rid of them,
Mm-hmm.
and I was just shocked that my son was taking these pills that he was once so against. And I got to tell you, Daryl, my boy became addicted to those pills so quickly. I mean, from the start to the end of his life was about 2 years.
Mm.
I mean, most people in my family, I've never known anyone who has overdosed. I've never had friends that have overdosed. And even working in the community, I had never encountered people that shared that with me. And so my idea of an overdose was that happens to someone that uses for years, like 20 years, and they're living in these really harsh conditions and, they've hit the rock bottom, if you will.
Now
Well,
these, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Perla, but these pills, the Xanax pills that he was getting online, right from the beginning, do you think they were all manufactured pills that had fentanyl in them, or do you think he ended up, or you don't know, but he ended up the last batch he got had fentanyl?
well, he was getting them from friends at that time who lived in the neighboring.
Okay, that's right. Yeah, you said that.
I I think that in the beginning,
Hmm.
as you know, people were being overprescribed medication. So
Hmm.
getting your hands on a legitimate Xanax or Oxy prior to 2018 was
Hmm.
not uncommon. There was like an overflow of these pills flooding our community from all the
Hmm.
doctors prescribing over prescribing these. So I I believe that he was taking legitimate pills
Right.
in the
Right.
beginning. Otherwise, I don't think he would have
He wouldn't have
lasted.
survived. Yeah. And then COVID happened. And 2020 was a hard time for everybody. I mean, there were a lot of people that didn't have psychological issues, at least that were bad prior to COVID, that now, because of the isolation and all that was going on and all of the other things going on in the news, people are now depressed and anxious when they might not have been before. So, I mean, that just amplified everything, made it even worse. So
We
you
were so limited to medical care and
Mm,
resources, right?
mhm, mhm. And then you said that he was staying with his grandmother during part of this time, kind of in and out of your home some.
So during 2019 was a difficult year for us. He was in and out of treatment almost every 3 months. I mean, I relocated now I'm married. And so my husband and I moved to try to get him out of this environment. We thought, okay, this environment is obviously not conducive for his well being and growth or healing. So we moved. My son went into treatment on his own accord. You know, he said, Mom, I don't want to be like this. I'm sorry. He had a very sincere, desire to be sober. And so he went into treatment. While he was in treatment, I packed up our house and I moved to completely different side of town, if you will. And when he got out of treatment, he was doing really well, but he would relapse about every 3 months, and that was a struggle. And
Mhm,
so now we are in 2020 and getting any type of rehab. He relapsed in 2020, but we were able to get him into a program which he completed. And while he was in that treatment program, he was working with a therapist who, with the help of that therapist, he called me one evening and said to me that he had been sexually abused by his father between the ages of 6 and 9. And, I was so angry, not at my son, but at the father.
Mm,
And he said, "You see, mom, this is why I didn't tell you." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I didn't want you to do something." He was concerned that he would lose me.
mhm,
He said, "I don't want you to get in trouble. I don't want nothing to happen to you." And I remember I just said, "Well, we have to tell someone." And, his therapist quickly intervened and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, what is more important right now? Your son's sobriety or, you know, revenge?" And I thought, this
mhm,
isn't revenge. And I said, "But obviously my son is the top priority,
mhm,
and my son." She said, "Okay, well then wait till he's strong enough to confront this." And so, I mean, all I cared about was my boy, and I wanted him to come through and live the life that he had always dreamed of as a young man. And so I dropped it. I had no other choice. I mean, I will tell you, between you and I made my phone calls to law enforcement, and I I I filed a complaint, but nothing was ever done with that.
mhm,
Anyhow, now we're in the midst of this lockdown and pandemic, and I remember it was Father's Day 2020, just a few months before I lost my son. And Elijah called me, and he had this lightness and this joy in his voice. I mean, I can hear it now. He was just so happy. And he says, "Mom, first off, happy Father's Day."
mhm,
And he said, "Thank you, Mom, for always being my mom and my dad." And it was just very touching, for him to say that. He's 19-year-old young man, or he was 20 actually at this point. Was he 20? He was 20 now. And he said, "You're never going to guess what I did, Mom." And I said, "What?" He says, "I called my grandmother, his dad's mom, the man who abused him, and I told her to tell my dad that I forgive him."
mm,
I got to tell you, my initial reaction was like, "What? Why would you do that?" It wasn't very nice.
mm,
And I remember him saying, "Mom, I thought you would be happy for me." And I said, "Well, I am, son, but well, he doesn't deserve that." And he says, "But God says that if we are to be forgiven, we are to forgive." And I mean, what can I say? I'm not going to go up against the word of God. And I said, "You're right, son. And I am so proud of you." And I really was proud of him. I mean, he taught me so many lessons in his short life. He said, "Don't go dropping your fruit, Mom." And I
mhm,
thought, what does that mean? And he schooled me on the verse in Galatians that talks about the fruit of the spirit,
mhm,
and
mhm,
I just embraced him from that moment on. And I thought, who am I to do this? I just want to love my son and help him get better. So that was Father's Day 2020. And Elijah and I spoke daily. Sometimes we talked on the phone multiple times a day. We were very close. I don't think I ever went more than a week without seeing my son, like physically seeing him. And the only reason we ever went that long without seeing each other is because he was in treatment and he wasn't allowed visits. But I mean, he was my world. And I remember September 15th, Elijah was working. He was making really great music. I mean, rap music, but it had some good stuff. He had some good stuff to say in some of those songs. Some of them probably wouldn't want to share with everyone,
mhm,
but towards the end of his life, he made some music that I'm really proud of. And I remember him calling me September 15th, about 11 p.m. I was already in bed. And I remember answering my phone. I felt something off. I got to tell you, Daryl, something was off. He normally wouldn't call me that late unless there was something, kind of, important. But nevertheless, he called me to confirm our date the next day. We were going to have a mom and son date. We were going to have breakfast together. I wanted to go to our Wednesday service together and just spend the day. And so he called me and said, Mom, what time are you going to pick me up? And I remember telling him 7 a.m. So go to sleep. Why are you calling me so late? And he said, okay, Mom, 7 a.m. Can we make it a little later? And I remember being needy. I was being a needy mom. I said, I hate when you change plans. I want to see you early. I want to
Mhm.
have breakfast. And in the end, we hung up the phone. And I remember praying for my son. Something in my spirit just felt off. And I mean, obviously, I didn't know that my son was going to die. And so I just started praying for him, and I asked God to send his angels to him and to protect him, and whatever it is that my son was struggling with in that moment, that he would be there with him. And I believe the Lord answered my prayers. I mean, the outcome wasn't what I would have wanted, but
Mhm.
God knows. The next morning, my husband usually leaves to work about 4 a.m., 4:30ish, and my his grandmother, who my son had been staying with for the last couple of weeks, he was there to protect grandma. Grandma had said she was feeling lonely because of the isolation that happened during the pandemic and that she had no visits. And she shared with him that she was afraid that the riots might reach her house because she lived in an area where those things were happening. And so
Mhm.
my son said, oh, Grandma, you don't have to be afraid. I'll go and stay with you, Grandma. I mean, imagine that. His grandmother was in her, I don't know, she's retired. She's much older than him. She's not very active. So I just thought, my son has such a good heart. He would go and he could be anywhere else. I mean, really, but he wanted to go and protect grandma. So that's why he was there. She calls me on the 16th of September and tells me that my son is dead.
Mhm.
I rushed over to her house, which was about 20 minutes from where I live, and there was a coroner in the room where my son's body was at. They would not allow me to enter the room. About an hour after I arrived, they wheeled my son's body out on a stretcher. He was zipped in a black bag. They didn't want to let me see him. I said, I have to see him. I remember zipping down the little bag and I saw his face. He looked so peaceful, Daryl. His little mouth was shut. His eyes were closed. His skin looked glowing. I felt like, is that how you look when you die? I mean, I've
Mhm.
seen other people, but I feel like the Lord was just with me that day in that moment. It was the hardest thing I've seen before. But shortly after they wheeled him out of the house, I remember a narcotics officer coming in and saying, we believe the cause of death is fentanyl. And I thought my son wasn't into fentanyl. My son liked marijuana and Xanax. Those were the things that he was struggling with for the last 2 years. And so that is what propelled me to, start sharing this story. And that's why I started this nonprofit. Back in 2020, you couldn't get Narcan unless it was prescribed to you. And then they changed the rules and made it that it would be available, but it would cost about $250 for one box of Narcan.
Mhm.
So if you had a nonprofit, you could get it through the state for free and distribute it. So that was my motivation for starting a nonprofit. And I've been doing that now for the last 5 years, training people on how to reverse opioid overdoses, teaching them um, what some of the signs and symptoms are of an overdose. I mean, things that I didn't know, things that I wish I would have known about prior to losing my son, especially talking about fentanyl. Now I talk to kids, and parents alike about the dangers of, the current drug landscape in general.
Yeah.
And because of fentanyl, Daryl, it's so scary, but now we have other drugs that are coming out into the scene that are even worse than fentanyl. And so
Yeah. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are a lot of things out there that are really scary. Um,
I
you
wanted to show
know,
you a picture really quick. I have one of
oh yeah, let me see that.
this is one of our
Wow.
last photos
What a
together.
good looking kid. Yeah. Wow. He was handsome.
That was our
Yeah.
last Mother's Day together.
Hmm.
He came
Hmm.
home from work with balloons and chocolate and a beautiful gift.
Hmm.
I really miss my son.
Yeah. I
I
know.
wished I would have
Hmm.
known what I know now. I'm sure you
Hmm.
do too, Daryl.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm so sorry for your loss. You've been doing
Yeah.
this for a lot longer than I have.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry for your loss. And, just listening to the stories, heart wrenching, a couple of things I want to bring out about that. But before I do, you were talking earlier about the Snapchat, right? And that he bought the what he thought were Xanax pills, and it turned out that there was fentanyl in the Xanax, and that was the only active ingredient in those pills. And the young man is doing prison time now
Yeah,
that
so
sold him those pills.
I I took it upon myself. Initially when my son died, I was told this is his fault.
Hmm.
He should have never went onto the dark web to purchase pills. I was told you should have taught your son better, and also that these are victimless crimes. So
Mm,
basically, get over it.
mm,
And I thought, okay, I get it. My son made a mistake and he paid for it with his life, but it's against the law to sell drugs.
mhm, mhm,
And why is there no consequences or interviews or anything being done to find out a little bit more? My son reached out to this person. It appeared that my son trusted this young man
mhm,
through Snapchat, and he initially asked for Xanax. And this young man says, I have all these other things on the menu. It's all quality with me, best stuff in Orange County, which is the county that we live in. And for whatever reason, my son went for it, and he delivered these blue pills to my son, oxys.
mhm,
They look like them. He purchased 15 from this young man for $300. If the cost of buying a fentanyl pill is about $2 to $5.
mm,
So I believe that my son thought he was taking something that was legit to have paid $20 a pop. He ordered 15. The day that he passed away, I found 14 pills left, and the narcotics detective confiscated that, took him to the lab, and said that each one of those pills contained a lethal dose of fentanyl. That all it
mm,
was a filler, a binding agent, and fentanyl. And we had a suspect, but law enforcement at the time would not follow him. They would tell me things like it can be anyone. It was on Snapchat. They can change their names and identities. And I thought, okay, I'm not buying it. So I created a Snapchat account of my own and I friend requested the drug dealer.
mhm,
And long story short, I found him and he was at a car dealership buying a vehicle. And he just so happened to be sitting down with his ID on the table and all the things that the detective said he would need to identify this person. I called the detective from that CarMax dealership and said, I'm standing right here. I could kill this man. And that detective lost it. He said, get out of there now. Get out of there before I, charge you for interfering with an investigation. I said, what investigation? You told me to
right.
take a vote. You told me you had no idea who this man was. So that forced
Mhm,
this detective to do his job.
mhm, mhm.
Um,
I love it.
Not only that, because things were taking so long, I remember I blew my own cover. I saw this young man um, on a shopping spree. He had bags of Gucci handbags, and he was flaunting them all over
Mm-hmm.
his Snapchat account. And so I remember I was not in a good headspace, and I finally blew my cover and I said, "Look, young man, you must not realize what you're doing." I said, "But my son trusted you," because he was advertising very openly, not only his shopping sprees, but he was also advertising all kinds of drugs
Mm-hmm.
very openly. And Snapchat would not shut down this account. I mean, it was ridiculous. So I blew my cover. I confronted him and I said, "You obviously do not know what you're doing." And I begged him. I said, "Please," I said, "my son trusted you for whatever reason. He thought you were his boy." I
Mm-hmm.
said, "You obviously don't know what you're selling, but the stuff you're selling is poison." I told him, "Please stop. Ask God to forgive you. My son is dead. He only took one of the pills that you brought to him." Well, this young man had no remorse. I mean, as a matter of fact, he said some ugly things, and then he tried to intimidate me by sending other people to my social media accounts to, make threats. I've had
Mm-hmm.
a number of things happen. My car's been keyed. There is a dead rat one morning when I walk out to my car, right there in the driver's side. Um, I mean, I've had people come to my front door. It's scary, but not really, because I have God who's on my side and he's my protector and he's protected me. But it took a lot to get this young man to be held responsible. And I mean, I got to say, this young man was stopped 2 years after my son died by the Drug Enforcement Administration. Thank God for those men and women. But they stopped him, and at the time of his arrest, he had enough fentanyl to kill over 500,000 people, in addition to other narcotics and weapons. And now he was sitting behind bars in a federal prison, and he'll be there for a very long time. I always tell people that it brought me no joy to see this young man get sentenced. I'm not like, "Oh, happy, let's celebrate." It's sad to me because he could have stopped,
Yeah.
but it's what was necessary, because most people, despite them knowing that they're hurting others, killing people in this case, they will not stop. Their motivation, if you ask me, is fueled by money, which is
Mm-hmm.
and greed, which
Yeah.
is the root of all evil. At the time of this young man's arrest, I thought, why would someone do this? I mean, I really had mercy on this young man. I knew who his mother was. I knew where he lived. I knew who his siblings was. I could have turned into a monster
Yeah.
and attacked.
I get it. I was in that same headspace for a while where, I just wanted to find the people who I felt like had been a bad influence on Chase, and I did find some of them, and we had some conversations, and it kind of took a different turn than what I expected. But we talked a little bit about the trauma earlier. I'm just going to touch on this again a little bit. That I found it to be very common in many cases that sometimes the parents know what kind of trauma their child has been through. Sometimes they don't, and maybe there's not always trauma involved in cases where where people have become addicted to drugs or alcohol. But in a lot of cases, there is some significant trauma, and certainly Eli was dealing with that. And I just parents. I think parents are just overwhelmed when they first find out that their child is using drugs or alcohol, or has an addiction to drugs or alcohol, and usually it's been going on for a little while by the time they figure it out, and so there's all kinds of self blame and shame that comes up. A lot of parents end up enabling or trying to control the situation. They have attempts to control their adult child, and they usually backfires, right? Can you speak to that a little bit? I mean, I don't know what your I know so far it sounds like everything you did, once you figured out what was going on, like you were right on top of everything.
I remember while I was going through that, my heart would ache for parents who didn't know some of the stuff that I knew. I
Mm,
don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I have a background in,
mm-hmm,
social services and mental health. I worked for the county's healthcare agency, and I worked with people with substance abuse disorders. So I feel like some of that experience allowed me to advocate for my son. I mean, I really had to go in there hard and tell doctors and therapists, like, my son is struggling. What are you waiting for? Are you waiting for him to die?
mm,
I mean, but it was because I had advocated and I knew some of the lingo, and I knew that, okay, if you can't help me, let me talk to the officer of the day. And if the officer of the day can't help me, let me talk to, and I would go up the ladder until I'd get help. That is so draining for so many people. And my heart goes out to people that are trying to get services for their kids and are just being, it's not bad enough. We only take them if it's this bad. And it's like, why does it have to get that bad for you
mm,
to help my child? And, at some point it did get that bad. And now they're like, okay, welcome, welcome. We'll get him into treatment. And it's like, man, I get frustrated. But even with that, I mean, I know that that experience opened more doors. And I got to say, parents, if you're struggling with that, don't back down. You have a voice and there's ways to do it. I'll say that cussing and yelling is not going to get you very far. So, you know, be prepared. Walk in there with some patience. But I mean, I feel like that helped me get him help some of those times. And I'm so sorry. I think I just went off on a tangent, Darrow. What
no,
was the question
no,
again?
that's good.
You were asking me about like the mental health stuff and
Yeah.
uh, enabling with
Hmm.
because I knew some of that. I don't think that I was an enabling mom
Hmm.
at
Yeah, I don't think
all.
so, based on what you told
However, there was enablers in my family and
me. Mm,
people that did not have respect and that crossed boundaries. And I don't think that they meant to cause the harm that they caused,
hmm.
but if there's enablers in the mix, it makes it so difficult. I mean, truly, his grandmother was the number one enabler in my eyes. And I hate to sound like I'm talking bad about people, but the truth is that's who she was. She knew
Mm,
that my son was hurting. She was so desperate to see him feel better that he would tell her, Grandma, I need $300. I owe my friend some money. And hello, the boy is struggling with addiction. You know that. Like, let's not give him money. I would tell her,
mm,
please don't give him money.
mhm,
He
mhm,
doesn't need it for anything. He has everything he needs at home. I provide for him. If you want to bless him with something, talk to me about it, please. But she would go behind my back, buy him cell phones, give him money, even go as far as taking him to some of these drug dealers' homes.
hmm.
She would say, I didn't know that's what it was. But I mean, I
Yeah.
believe that there is some guilt, and that's a whole other story. I was told by a therapist that grandma was giving my son hush money because of what her
Mm,
son had done to my boy.
mm, mm,
Um, I didn't think all that at the time. I was just trying to survive myself as a parent and help my kid. I didn't have
mhm,
the
mhm.
mental capacity to think all those other thoughts. But
Right.
enabling is not helpful to anyone, not helpful to the parents trying to get their kids back on track, or to the person struggling with addiction. It hurts them more than anything.
Yeah,
uh,
and most of the time, I think family members that engage in enabling, they have good intentions. They really do want to help, and sometimes they're trying to soothe their own conscience, like you were saying, over things that may or may not have happened, and that they perceived harms that happened to their loved one, whatever that may be. And but yeah, it's not healthy in the long run. It's just always it's unhealthy.
Well,
Uh,
Drew, I don't know if I mentioned this, but my son died at his grandmother's house.
mhm, mm,
She had a spare bedroom for him. She would tell him things like, "Well, if you're not happy with mom, you can always come here. She would tell him, this is going to be your home one day, and that's your room. So, you don't have to be with mom." And I would get so annoyed by that. But my son was 18 or older at this point, and I mean, what could I say? And it's like,
mhm,
Elijah,
mm,
you have to make your own decisions. And you know, he went over there for the right intentions. And at this at this time in our life, we were both, on fire for the Lord. We were practicing forgiveness. So I was really not thinking negative of this woman. I thought, okay, she knows enough. She's seen what these last 2 years have been like. And I thought we were all on the same page. I'm not saying that she necessarily did anything, at the time of my son's death, but you know, um, the night that Elijah died, she said that he stepped out for a couple minutes. Not unusual. Like, I wouldn't go chasing down my grandkid if he stepped out for less than 5 minutes. So she didn't think nothing of that. She asked him, "Where did you go?" And he said, "Oh, I just stepped out for a moment. I wanted to." He made up some random excuse for leaving the house. I wish you would have, I don't know. I mean, I wish so many things would have happened differently, but
mm,
I believe that that's when he stepped out to meet the drug dealer and get the drugs. I had asked her, if you're going to have him here, one of the things that we practice at home is he's going to be a grown man one day. He's 20 years old and I want him to be responsible. So I asked her, if you're going to have him there, I want him to be responsible and contribute.
mhm,
Have him contribute to the expenses of buying food or the electric bill. Maybe have him pay the Wi-Fi since he uses that so often.
mhm,
She was like, "No, no, no, I'm not going to charge him." And I said, "Well, you're enabling him. I don't want my son to grow up to be 40 years old thinking that grandma's going to come to the rescue." And so we had an agreement that she would, charge him, and Elijah was happy to do that. So the day that Elijah died, she says that he went to her with $300, Daryl,
mm,
and said, "Here, grandma, this is for food or for whatever you want to use it for."
mhm,
Earlier that day,
mm,
he gave her that. He had just got paid. He said, "Here, grandma." And she said, "No, no, no, you save it. Well,
mm.
that $300 is what he used to buy his drugs that night.
Wow, wow,
And again, I'm not putting blame on her, but I think
yeah,
that loved ones need to be aware.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
in the end, she found my son dead. What
mm,
a
mm.
traumatizing
I
experience
know,
that must have
I
been
know,
for her.
yeah,
She
yeah,
said that she found him on his knees at the edge of his bed at about midnight, and she thought he was asleep. She said she went to wake him up. In my mind, I'm like, why is that? My son never fell asleep in that position. Why would
mm.
you think that was normal? I wish she would have called me. I wish she would have called 911. She said he was unresponsive, but that he was snoring.
Ah,
A sign and symptom of an overdose
yeah.
is this deep
How long did
rapid.
she wait? How long did she wait before she called 911?
She walked out of the room. She said she went to bed.
Mm,
And around 4 o'clock in the morning, when she woke up to use the restroom, he was still in that same position, but now
mm,
his body was cold.
mm, 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 mm. Wow, so tragic. Ah, man. I know there's some similarities between my experience and yours, but there's quite different in a lot of ways too. And for me, I didn't understand why Chase was going through what he was going through. I had some ideas, but I didn't understand the drug use, at the time so much. And I can say that, I was experiencing pain mostly in the form of fear at that time. Like, my son's going to die or he's going to prison. Something bad is going to happen. And I was like, literally have butterflies in the pit of my stomach that never seemed to go away. We get a little bit better, but then it would come back. And, then it's like I was always worried about him when I didn't know where he was. Where is he? Who's he with? What is he doing? And sometimes I was snooping around, trying to spy on him and stuff and find out. And kind of like you with your detective work after the fact, like, and some going on during that time, finding his dealer and things. Like I can find people if I want to, I can hunt people down. I guess, for me, it's a little bit different in that I was, to some extent, I was the enabler. I was more of a detective rescuer, trying to solve this problem, trying to figure out what the problem was. And I think for me, the life transformation that really took place, and there have been several turning points in my life where I've changed, but certainly when this happened, there was a big transformation that it's taken some time, and I'm still going through it. Where I began to look at myself and like, what can I change? Because I can't change the circumstances. I can't. There's nothing I can do to bring Chase back. What can I change? And every time I run into conflict with other people now, that's kind of my outlook. Instead of, immediately I may get a little bit frustrated with people. Why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they doing that? And then I realize, well, I can't change them. So I have to take all of that negative energy and I have to turn it inward and go, what can I change? How can I communicate better with these people? What can I do differently that maybe will have an impact on them, a positive impact? And or in some cases, I just have to let it go,
Pray
and just
about it
put it.
too.
So what's that?
We got to pray about some of these.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of times God he gives us different answers, like sometimes he'll give us the answer. Well, this is what you need to do. These are the actions you need to take. Other times God says, let it go. Or he says, let me handle it and you do other things, or I'll answer that when I'm ready to. And you're not God. And so I'll answer it in the way I want to when I'm ready to. And I have my reasons for that. And I have to trust him. And he always has the right reasons and the right motive, but we can't always see it at the time. And so I've had to learn to trust more. But certainly, I guess my message to parents would be, don't, like, when you're going through the pain of dealing with a child battling addiction, put more of the focus back on yourself and what you can change. Because I didn't begin my transformation like that until after Chase died. Now, what if I had taken all that pain, all that fear that I was feeling at the time, and had begun turning that more inward then and working on myself more then? Would we have had a different outcome with Chase? Maybe, maybe not. But at least I would have begun the work sooner on myself.
I
Anyway, and go ahead.
I was just gonna say that is like so imperative. I remember, struggling with drinking. I would never get in trouble. I always went to work, but I was a frequent drinker at home.
Hmm.
And I remember one of my last conversations with my son was, "Well, you drink." And I said, "Yeah, but I remember making excuses like, but I'm not getting in trouble, Elijah. I'm not getting behind the wheel and driving. I'm not getting arrested or not showing up to work the next day." Well, I only say that to say that a lot of our kids are trying, and sometimes in their own environment, we might not see it. Like I would say, well, I had an excuse for drinking, if you will. That was, or so I thought. And I look back and I wish that I could have been stronger in that time, because imagine how hard it was for me to say stop drinking completely, especially around your son, and then expect him to stop what he was doing. We really do need to take a look. And I'm not blaming parents by no means, but there is some things that are within our control that sometimes we're like maybe too prideful to admit, or we make excuses. I wonder, had I been provided a 100% sober environment for my son had he maybe would have encouraged him a little bit more. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
just but we do need to take those things into account. If it's for someone who didn't identify as an alcoholic, let's say, why couldn't I just completely cut that out? What was it?
Mm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. And I'm at this weird place where I don't look back. I think a lot of people think when I reflect back on, well, these are the things I could have done better, that I'm getting into this area of self blame and beating myself up. And I'm way beyond that. And I suspect that you are too, where it's like, okay, I'm going back there and talking about these things because I'm trying to find insights in all of that I can share with parents that are in that situation now, that they can take away and learn from. Okay, learn from my mistakes and the things that I could have done better and apply them to your situation now. But don't think that I'm beating myself up, because I can't. Whatever happened in the past is in the past, and I have to leave that there, and ask God for forgiveness and where I've fallen short and move on.
I agree
Perla,
with
I'm sorry. Did I interrupt you? You were
no,
about
I
to say
just said
something.
I agree with you with that.
Yeah. So the title of the podcast is When God Intervenes. And certainly He's intervened in our lives in different ways. And I guess, what would you like to do with that title today? Like, how has God intervened in your life? We haven't had the outcomes with our children like we would hope, but yet here we are. We're still here, and we're not curled up in the fetal position in a corner somewhere. We're still here, and we're living life, and we're trying to make a difference. So, how has God intervened in your life?
oh, I wouldn't be standing here or sitting here, I should say, um, had it not been for having Christ in my life. There was very dark moments that I've experienced where I thought there's no way I'm going to survive this. I thought at one point I'd have to be hospitalized because of the mental torment that was I was feeling. And the moment that I would cry out to God, I would feel his warm embrace. And there was times where I didn't feel it, and all I could say was, God, please increase my faith. Like, I don't want to lose faith. People say to me, you what kind of a God do you serve that would allow this to happen? And I have to remind them, it's not God who did that. You think drugs are from God? You think
Mm,
molestation is from God?
mm, mm.
My son battled, my beautiful boy. I mean, your boy was so handsome. Our kids were beautiful. Come
Yeah,
on. And my son would struggle with self-esteem issues and think that
yeah,
he was ugly. Where is that from? That's not from God.
that's right.
And so if it's not from God, then who is it from? And so then I have to identify the enemy in this
Mm,
case. God's not my enemy. God has been trying to guide me and teach us the right way to live.
mm,
And we are the ones, humans, we fall short, but God is always there. And so
mm,
in my weakest moments, in my most depressed moments, I've been able to call out to God, and He has sustained me. He gives me the strength to get up every day to do what I do. He has shown me that, His promises are real. And when Elijah was born, I said, Lord, this is your child. Help me to be a good mom. Thank you. But that is God's baby. And I just think of heaven and the promises and what the word of God says. And I'm just filled with hope, knowing
mm,
that one
mm,
day I will be reunited with my son. And until then, I have work to do. And I give all the glory and all the honor to God. He's the one that allows me to do this. He provides for me. I haven't worked, Daryl. I haven't been paid for 5 years. I've worked my entire life since I was 14 years old. But here I am. I lack nothing.
mm,
And that's because of God. Some people will try to test me and say, well, what if it's fake? And I say, okay, well, what if it's fake? What if it's not real? Okay, we die and then that's it. But what if it is? Oh,
Mm,
but what if it is? The joy. And that's what I'm banking on. I'm banking on that heaven is real and that we serve a good God. And despite our losses, I believe that the Lord has our children right there next to him.
mm,
And
that's
as
great.
long as we continue on this path of believing and trusting, even when I fall short, I am not perfect. I am a sinner saved by grace. But even when I fall short, God is good and he is with us. And I just keep turning to him. I ask for forgiveness when I slip up. Trust me, I've had some wicked thoughts in my mind. And I have to surrender that. And I tell God, you take control. And you know what? Just like with this man being arrested, I was told from the gate, don't expect anything. You'll never see justice. These are victimless crimes. And I trusted on the Lord. I relied on him. It didn't happen as quickly as I wanted it to happen, but it
Mm,
happened. And for that, I thank God. And I want to do right and I want to do good as long as I'm here. Not only because that's the kind of heart the Lord has given me, but I want to honor God and I want to honor my son as well. And this is one way that I get to do that. Elijah was not perfect. Elijah made mistakes. Yeah, I can talk, your ear off about all the wonderful things, but he struggled too.
mm,
Did he deserve to die through that deceitful way? No. Did Chase deserve what happened to him? No. There are choices that our kids are making, and I don't want to, act like I'm delusional. Like our kids made choices to do things. Did Elijah mean to take fentanyl? I don't believe that that's what he
no,
was seeking that night. And I know Chase didn't want to die that night either.
no.
Or that day, I should say.
There's so many good things I could add to that, but you've given me a lot of good things to think about there. Let's talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing. I know you and I have done some advocacy work in Washington D.C. Around some of the things going on with marijuana, specifically Delta 8. Let's just go ahead and talk about a little bit more in detail about your work and tell people, tell the listeners, let's get your website out there, talk about that a little bit, and where they can find you, how they can get more information about what you're doing.
Absolutely. So you can learn more about Project Eli by going onto the website. It's www.projecteli.info. Or you can go onto Facebook. If you type up Project Eli and drug prevention, perhaps, it should pop up for you on Facebook. I also have an Instagram. My Instagram name is at Elijah's, so ELIJAH apostrophe S dot mama, MAMA. I'd be happy to connect with any of the listeners on any of those platforms. But what Project Eli's focus is still on drug prevention and warning our youth. However, we've been able to expand and offer support groups for parents who have been affected or anyone who has really been affected by the loss of a loved one due to substance use. We have an in person peer to peer support group that is facilitated by myself. I mean, I run that group with another survivor of crime. She's a wonderful lady that has partnered with me from an organization called Crime Survivors. But we also have Zoom support groups that are offered online for parents who have lost children to fentanyl. And that is something that I'm really proud of. I've helped organize parent retreats where we come together, and we had a wonderful event with an organization called Gloves for Grief where we got to go out and box and hit a punching bag. Man, it was a great time. I mean, we were all there didn't really know what to expect, but we left energized, and it just felt like, you know, load was lifted from all of
Mm,
us. I think I can speak for all the parents who joined me that evening. So we try to get together, support one another, and then we do that with advocacy as well. So when a parent gets justice, we try to rally around them and go to court with them and be their support, or help lead and guide people as to how to navigate the justice system so that they can see what options are available to hold, you know, these drug dealers accountable for the loss of life.
mhm, mhm.
um, I mean, I'm
Yeah.
still in beginning phases, but it's been such an honor to have met so many great people like yourself, Daryl. You are a true champ. You taught us so much, and I can speak for Julie, the other mom that was there. I mean, you really just, you know what you're doing, and I really applaud you for the work that you do. But that's been an honor to be able to go out and speak on behalf of other parents.
Mhm, mm,
And we do what we can. I mean, I don't know what's to come. I said, God, what is it that you want me to do? What do you want me to do, Lord? This can't be it. And I felt him say, go out and tell people about this.
mm,
Um, I've also written a book. Well, I didn't write it, but I'm part of a book that was inspired by me. And it's the story of 10 mothers who have lost children. We all lost children in different ways. Some lost
mhm,
their children to car accidents or to COVID, all different stories. But the idea behind that is to share our story and hope to prove, you know, my hope is that it'll encourage other parents to not give up and to find, you know, purpose in this pain that we're
mhm,
dealing with.
mhm, mhm,
And so that is actually a book that's available on Amazon called Love's Labor Lost by Ruth Johnson. And it's a beautiful faith-based book, and it shares the stories of moms and how we've been able to overcome, you know, our grief and some of the things that we did to get to this place. I mean, I miss my son every day, and I'm sure you miss Chase every day
mhm.
as well. It's not something that goes away, but you know, with God by my side, and I feel I feel confident and I feel strong enough to continue, you know,
Mhm,
this life
mhm.
that I've been given.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100% on that. That, were it not for my deep faith, my belief in God, and my relationship with Him through Jesus, were it not for that, I would not have the strength to be able to have withstood the pain that comes along with losing a child. And not only that, but just to be able to go on and function and do some of the things that God has been able to lead me to do. And I couldn't have done it under my own power. So certainly we're
And
together in that. Um,
I encourage listeners to, you know, they say all it takes is uh, faith the size of a mustard seed. And if you're
mm,
struggling, I encourage you to give it a shot because you won't be disappointed. And I'm just really grateful to have been able to share with you and your listeners, Daryl. I am so proud of you and the work that you do, and I look forward to continuing to work with you and you know, fighting the good fight together.
yeah, same here. And in fact, as this interview has gone on, I'm thinking about so many more questions I want to ask you. So I think we'll have to do it again. We'll have to do another interview, and we definitely need to talk more because you generate ideas for me. You help me come up with other ideas. So, but yeah, let's stay in touch and let's do this again soon. Perla, wow, it's been great. Been great having you on the podcast as a guest, and like I said, I look forward to having more conversations with you soon. Thank you for tuning in to When God Intervenes. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Your feedback helps us reach more families in need of hope and healing. For more resources and support, visit our website at thefamilyrecoverycoach.com. Until next time.